Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J. I've done more than a few reviews thus far, and as I keep going with them, I think it's important for a newcomer to understand the method to the madness. The reason why I've been doing ongoing impressions videos is to give a degree of insight into how my opinion is developing, but instead of focusing on a couple games in particular, I wanted to focus more on the process. In this video, I hope to answer questions such as what I'm looking for, how I tend to weigh different factors, and the overall process that I use to put it together. To start, let's talk about the games that get selected. In most cases, I'm weighing three different things in my mind. My personal interest in a particular game, what kind of historical significance it may hold, and what kind of games I've reviewed lately. As an example of the former, the reason I looked at Draken and The Witcher are primarily personal, as they were both games that my dad and sister got to play before me, and they seemed interesting based on what I heard and saw from them. For historical significance, games like Star Wars Dark Forces and Descent were both good games in their own right, with the former adding new gameplay elements to the FPS genre, and the latter creating its own subgenre. The attempt to add variety into what I review is fairly self-explanatory, as it allows for a wider variety of games to be shown, even if I do tend to have a few staples that I draw from more so than others. Once I've picked a game to review, I'll then play through it, occasionally writing down ideas and thoughts that could get worked into an ongoing impressions video. I also used to make Let's Plays for the games I reviewed, but while they were useful to help me look over footage and gauge my reaction as I play, they were also time-consuming to create, which meant I haven't been able to do them recently. Regardless of whether I add commentary or not, the goal will be to record everything I see and attempt to catalog it to where I'll know what to look for when I'm making the review. Much of my critique is focused on two different aspects: what is actually in the game itself, and my reaction to it. The former is usually easier to gauge, since it comes down to how the controls handle where the focus of the story is and how all the pieces are related to each other. Understanding that last point is perhaps the most important aspect, as if I were to apply the same standard to every game I played, I wouldn't be able to simultaneously hold Half-Life 2 and Planescape Torment in such high regard. For the former, the focus was on creating an entertaining first-person shooter, taking advantage of an interconnected world and narrative to create a very compelling game. For the latter, it's almost purely focused on the circumstances of the main character and his interactions with a strange world, with little to no regard for the gameplay itself. Both of them have their eccentricities, but both of them also have their own target demographic, and to some degree one has to be able to recognize that fact, even for a game that one might not normally enjoy. It's the reason why I can appreciate a game like StarCraft Brood War without actually being any good at it. When it comes to my reaction, it somewhat ties into what's in the game and where the focus lies, but this part is where my subjective opinion comes into play. As and after I'm done playing a given section, I'll ask myself how I feel about it. After I've figured that out, the question is then to ask why I felt that way. For instance, when I reviewed Baldur's Gate, I kept having this lingering feeling that there should be more to this and that I should be enjoying it more than I was. After I began to replay the sequel, I realized that it was because I had played said sequel first, and though I was too young to fully appreciate it then, I had been applying the standards that the sequel set to the original. Though objectively I could realize that the original was still solid, the fact that the Infinity Engine was developed alongside it meant that it was a lot rougher around the edges and wasn't as good as I hoped for because of that. In fact, my expectations for a game can have just as much of an effect as the game itself. I went into Dark Forces 2 with high hopes looking to enjoy it, but as I ran into problems both technical and within the game itself, I ended up raking it over the coals more harshly than otherwise. However, for Shining Force 2, I had replayed the original recently, and because of that was much kinder to the sequel since it fixed up a lot of the problems that I had with said original. Not all of them, mind you, I still had plenty to complain about, but that led me to being kinder on the game than I would have otherwise. The key to all of this is that, in my eyes, all of these factors need to be laid bare, so that the viewer knows exactly where I'm coming from. It's the idea that even if I can't be 100% objective, I need to ensure that you know what factors may prevent me from getting there. The prelude that I give for the start of each review is really helpful to set that tone, to where if I branch out and review newer games, I'm tempted to still keep that as an element. So before we get to the more technical aspects, I'll go through a few of the things which I tend to look for the most. When it comes to investment, money usually doesn't factor into the equation. With how many games there are and with how big my Steam back catalog is, finding a game to play isn't difficult, and I can count with one hand the number of games that I've purchased at full price. Because of that, instead of thinking about the monetary investment, my focus is on the time investment. When I am sitting down to play a game, was it worth the time that I devoted to it? To help me determine that, I have a few things that I tend to look for. First, I identify the core gameplay loop and the supporting elements. and then determine how well each element was executed in terms of how they both stand on their own and work together. If two elements appear disjointed or if the supporting elements play more of a role than I expected, there's something to talk about. Because of those standards, there are very few things that remain consistent across every game, but in the vast majority of cases, whenever I have something to complain about, it usually boils down to a pacing, communication, or control issue. If everything is paced in a way that feels good, then I can often forgive other issues because at least I'm remaining engaged with whatever's presented. If the game properly communicates what it wants me to do, then that means I'll be less frustrated and more receptive to whatever it wants to throw at me next. If the controls are tight, then you can throw the most insanely difficult gameplay section at me, and what might have been a bad time is now working to your advantage. That covers everything I can think of for the substance of my reviews, so let's move on to how I put them together. Despite whatever impression you may have, I am not a natural speaker. So while I can do sort of okay when I've got nerves driving me in a public situation, that pressure is virtually non-existent when I'm talking to a computer screen. The only time nerves ever enter the equation is when it comes to pushing the publish a schedule button, and by then most of what I need to say is already done. Because of that, virtually everything I do is put into writing first, as I find it easier to collect my thoughts and determine what exactly to say that way. In keeping with the medium I'm covering, the majority of scripts that I do are written in one sitting. Since the video games are made up of a lot of interconnected elements, if I'm doing my job right, I should be able to seamlessly connect everything that I want to say. The only real exceptions to this are when I need to make a hard cut for spoilers or lengthy gameplay explanations, or if I'm switching away from a topic in a hurry for comedic effect. Because of this writing process, all of the crucial writing happens after I've finished playing the game. I sometimes make what I call review fragments addressing a specific topic, but these aren't usually copied into the final script, but rather worked in based on the material discussed before and after. I may also use that as a method of trying different approaches to a subject, especially if what I have to say is in some part controversial. For instance, I had multiple different fragments for the gameplay discussion of Shining Force 2 because I noticed a fundamental disconnect within said game's genre, and wanted to ensure that I explained it as best as I could. That should cover everything within the script, but there is one major issue with how I handle this part. Due to wanting the script to be interconnected, that also means if I inevitably forget to mention something, it becomes much more difficult to stitch in. In fact, if you look carefully at some of my reviews, you can probably tell where I unnaturally stitched in an element that I forgot to mention. For all I know, as I'm writing this now, I'll probably include one or two of those once I step away and look at this later. Either way, whether I find that missing aspect before or after doing the audio portion, that audio recording is in some way harder and more time consuming than any other part of the review. As mentioned earlier, I'm not a natural speaker, and no matter how many times you listen to yourself, you never really get used to what you sound like. Even beyond troubles with my voice itself, the whole process is incredibly tedious. You have to be very careful about how you're saying something, you may have to do multiple takes, and the first time I record something is usually thrown out because, that is not what I wanted to sound like for this video, even though I may inevitably accept a bad take anyway because after a while you're just so sick of audio editing and just want to be done and I don't care how good or bad this take is, we're gonna make it work this time! Honestly, the actual video editing part is the easiest for me because at that point I've already committed to what the audio is gonna be, and I just need to match what I've said with relevant game footage. Finding said footage can sometimes be tricky depending on how specific it needs to be, but while that's also tedious, you at least have the visual element coming together, and we'll get to see a final product by the end of it. With the audio editing, not so much. Admittedly, it can get more difficult if you want to try and show more than one thing happening at once, and my low-end machine has trouble with handling all the memory required, but at least it looks like I'm making progress, and I get a better idea as to how long it'll take. While I sometimes have to do the audio editing in more than one sitting, sometimes I'll just spend all day editing the video portion because I get into that trance and don't come up for air until after I've realized how much time has passed. Which, fortunately for me, doesn't require too much time overall since I'm just showing relevant gameplay footage. Sometimes when I need a specific visual it can be more time consuming, but I think I've repeated myself enough on that front. So before I go, here's a quick rundown of the software I use. For video recording, I usually use Bandicam, as it tends to be the kindest on my low-end hardware, though in some circumstances I get better results using Fraps. For audio recording, I use Audacity, which is, to my surprise, one of the better pieces of audio recording and editing software that you can find, and it's completely free on top of that. For video editing, I use a program called OpenShot, which is one of many different options that I have access to by virtue of dual booting with Windows and Linux on my main computer. It's really limited when it comes to animation or setting up layouts, but for what I typically use it for, it's not a major issue for me. I believe OpenShot has a Windows version now, but right now it still has some issues with real-time playback, so I've been using an older version that's only available for Linux. If I had a more powerful machine, I'd probably be using the newest version, but at the same time, if I had a more powerful machine, I'd also probably be able to afford premium video editing software. Either way, that's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for when the next review comes out, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. Also, before I run off, I'd like some feedback on part of the review. I've been using an end card for a while to highlight what are, in my mind, the most important aspects of the game, along with a more general should I play it recommendation. By design, said recommendation is meant to be arbitrary, as I don't think I could remain consistent in terms of review scores, but I've been thinking of scrapping that recommendation and maybe the entire end card itself. Theoretically, if I'm doing my job right, you shouldn't need to read it because I've had your attention and communicated clearly how I feel, and it may end up being distracting since I pull it out when I'm making my closing statements. Regardless, I'd better get to work on that next review because while I might not have a lot of time until the holidays, I think I should be able to finish another game in time to release a review, well, eventually. I'm on the home stretch of a computer science degree, so that has to take priority, but once that's done, I'm hoping I can get some degree of stability and be able to do this more regularly. Until that gets sorted out, however, I'd better get back to work, and we'll see you all later.